What if the cartoons you grew up with were never meant for children at all? Imagine ink and paint used not to teach morals, but to provoke outrage. Before 1975, a secret wave of animated films pushed beyond innocence and into dangerous adult territory. These were not Saturday morning shows, but cinematic time bombs that rattled censors and redefined what animation could dare to say. Number 12. Fritz the Cat, 1972. When Ralph Bakshi released Fritz the Cat, the world of animation was shaken to its core. Until then, cartoons had lived safely inside the walls of Saturday morning television and cheerful movie shorts. Fritz changed everything. Adapted from Robert Crumb's underground comic, it followed a reckless feline through a corrupt city brimming with rebellion, greed, and fractured ideals. Bakshi's animation was fast, loud, and alive, filled with the pulse of a counterculture tired of pretending. But the censors saw something dangerous. Fritz became the first American animated film ever slapped with an X rating. Theaters refused to show it. Advertisers fled in terror. Critics argued it would destroy the medium. Crumb himself disowned it, saying Bakshi turned satire into scandal. Yet that backlash only fed the legend. Audiences poured into underground cinemas just to see what the panic was about. Behind the scenes, Bakshi fought every step. He clashed with producers who wanted a safer tone and fought with theaters who wanted cuts. But the film made millions, proving that adults were ready to see animation that dared to confront politics, hypocrisy, and desire instead of hiding behind childish fantasy. Fritz the Cat became a movement, a warning, and a triumph all at once. In the end, Fritz did not just provoke censors, it exposed them. It proved that animation could reflect the chaos of real life, not just dreams. Today, it stands as a crude, brilliant testament to creative freedom and the dangers of playing it safe. Number 11. Yellow Submarine, 1968. When the Beatles agreed to an animated film, few expected a cultural earthquake. Yellow Submarine looked like a children's fantasy, but every frame was coded rebellion. Its candy-colored world of Pepperland, attacked by the joyless blue meanies, became a thinly veiled allegory for conformity, authoritarianism, and war. It was whimsical on the surface, but underneath it pulsed with countercultural fire. British censors were unsure what to make of it. The psychedelic imagery felt hypnotic, almost dangerous. Critics accused it of encouraging rebellion and corruption of youth. Schools banned screenings, claiming its swirling colors and cryptic dialogue would rot young minds. Yet teenagers and students saw it as a manifesto. A new generation embraced its message that love and creativity could outsmart oppression. The production was chaos. The Beatles were too busy to participate, leaving the animators at TVC London to craft the film almost entirely alone. Director George Dunning and designer Heinz Edelman built an entirely new language of animation, merging surrealist art with pop culture. Their studio became a battlefield of color experimentation and exhaustion. When the film finally premiered, audiences saw something no one had imagined before: an animated revolution born out of music and madness. Today, Yellow Submarine stands as proof that even joy can terrify the powerful. Its psychedelic optimism masked razor-sharp social commentary. Decades later, it still floats between innocence and rebellion, reminding the world that animation can change how generations dream. Number 10. Heavy Traffic, 1973. Ralph Bakshi's second major film, Heavy Traffic, was not a cartoon, it was a confession. Set in a brutal version of New York, it told the story of Michael, a young artist lost in a decaying city where fantasy and violence intertwined. The visuals blended gritty realism with surreal fever dreams, creating something neither live action nor animated, but a fractured mirror of Bakshi's own life. Censors could not handle it. Some theaters refused to show it. Others demanded edits before screenings. Reviewers were split down the middle. Some called it a masterpiece, others filth. The moral guardians of the early 70s wanted to ban it outright, afraid that animation was no longer a safe space for children. Bakshi did not care. He declared that animation had to grow up even if it meant bleeding on the page. Behind the scenes, the project nearly collapsed. The studio balked at its dark tone. Animators left mid-production, unable to handle Bakshi's relentless push for realism. He fused live-action shots with hand-drawn sequences, breaking every technical rule of the time. When it finally released, it earned cult acclaim among artists and filmmakers who saw it as a daring experiment in truth-telling. Heavy Traffic became more than just a film, it became an artifact of raw honesty. It showed that animation could be personal, violent, emotional, and unapologetically adult. Today, it remains one of the most haunting animated portraits ever made, a grim urban poem carved in ink and defiance. Number 9. Belladonna of Sadness, 1973. From Japan came a film so beautiful and disturbing that it sent censors into a frenzy. Belladonna of Sadness, directed by Eiichi Yamamoto and produced by Osamu Tezuka's Mushi. Production was a haunting watercolor nightmare, unlike anything animation had dared to show. Loosely inspired by the French witch trials of the Middle Ages, it told the story of Jeanne, a peasant woman who suffers cruelty at the hands of nobles and finds power through dark forces. The film's art style was astonishing. Entire scenes unfolded like moving paintings, brushstrokes pulsing with agony and desire. The pacing was dreamlike, often lingering in silence, letting the horror and the beauty breathe. But this poetic boldness became its curse. Censors accused it of being immoral, indecent, even dangerous to national values. Distributors refused to touch it. When it premiered in 1973, the audience was stunned into silence. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. Mushi production was collapsing financially, and the staff worked under punishing conditions. Many animators left before completion, and Yamamoto pushed the survivors to finish what would become their final masterpiece. Critics in Japan attacked it mercilessly, but in France and later America, underground circles hailed it as a feminist rebellion disguised as tragedy. For decades, Belladonna of Sadness vanished from public view, buried by shame and neglect. But when it was restored and re-released in the 21st century, a new generation saw what the censors had feared. It was not scandal, it was revolution. Today, it is remembered as one of the most daring works of animated art, a hypnotic portrait of suffering turned into transcendence. Number 8. Fantastic Planet, 1973. At first glance, Fantastic Planet looked like a psychedelic children's fable. But this French-Czechoslovak co-production by René Laloux and artist Roland Topor hid something far deeper and far more dangerous. Set on the distant world of Igam, where giant blue aliens known as Drogs keep humans as pets, it became one of the most unsettling allegories of oppression ever animated. Every frame was surreal. Paper cutout animation gave it a strange, lifeless beauty, a world where humans crawled like insects beneath their masters. The story of rebellion was quiet, patient, and devastating. When it premiered in Cannes, the jury was divided between awe and discomfort. Some hailed it as a visionary masterpiece, others walked out calling it blasphemous and obscene. Censors in several countries demanded edits, fearing its depiction of control rebellion and enlightenment was coded political propaganda. France's government film board hesitated to promote it, fearing accusations of radicalism. Yet artists, poets, and philosophers rallied behind it. The film became a cult treasure whispered about in underground screenings where audiences compared it to Orwell and Kafka, drawn in by its uncanny silence and philosophical violence. Behind the scenes, production stretched across years due to funding shortages and political tension between France and Czechoslovakia. The animators labored under both creative freedom and constant fear of collapse. But the final product was something eternal. A film that taught that animation could be pure thought visualized. Today, Fantastic Planet is seen not just as science fiction, but as spiritual rebellion. It still feels alien, still feels forbidden, and still dares audiences to question who the real captors are in our own world. Number 7. Dirty Duck, 1974. Dirty Duck wasn't just an animated film, it was a collision of ink, live-action chaos, and underground rebellion. Released in 1974, it followed a meek insurance clerk who was dragged into a surreal odyssey by a crude talking duck. But what jolted audiences wasn't the storyline, it was the film's wild blend of animation and raw live-action footage. Director Charles Swenson stitched together rough drawings, street clips, and documentary-style fragments, creating a kaleidoscope that looked more like a cultural breakdown than a movie. Censors panicked. The MPAA debated banning it entirely, claiming the shifting mix of mediums made the content unclassifiable. Theaters refused bookings, newspapers condemned it, and parents' groups accused it of aiming adult material at teens, despite the fact that no teenager could have survived the confusion. Critics called it trash or genius, depending on the hour. Behind the scenes, the production was barely functioning. Budgets evaporated, animators quit, and Swenson scavenged real footage from discarded reels to finish the film. Some street scenes, shot quickly and illegally, captured a gritty America that distributors didn't want on screen. Dirty Duck became a midnight legend, a messy, abrasive experiment that proved animation could leak into reality and reveal truths the censors desperately wanted buried. Number 6. Allegro Non Troppo, 1976. Though technically released just after the cutoff, Allegro Non Troppo was created and censored during the early 70s and embodies that turbulent pre-1975 spirit. Directed by Italian filmmaker Bruno Bozzetto, it was conceived as a twisted mirror to Walt Disney's Fantasia. But instead of celebrating classical music and beauty, Bozzetto's version turned it into satire, tragedy, and raw social commentary. Each animated segment was paired with famous symphonic works, from Debussy to Ravel. But rather than depicting cheerful dancing animals, it explored the collapse of civilization, greed, vanity, and the cruelty of progress. One segment shows humanity evolving from apes only to destroy the planet. Another follows a lonely cat wandering through ruins haunted by memories of its owner. The visuals were tender and heartbreaking, yet uncomfortably real. Censors in Italy were horrified. They accused Bozzetto of mocking religion and morality. Television stations refused to show it, and distributors warned him that animation audiences wanted joy, not despair. The satire struck too close to home. The live-action framing scenes, which showed an oppressive studio exploiting its animators, were read as attacks on the Italian film industry itself. Behind the scenes, Bozzetto fought for years to finish it with almost no funding. The animators worked for months on unpaid overtime driven by passion alone. When the film finally premiered, critics were split. Some hailed it as genius, others called it sacrilege. But in underground circles, it spread like wildfire, inspiring animators who felt suffocated by corporate control. Today, Allegro Non Troppo stands as one of Europe's boldest animated achievements, a haunting reflection on humanity's self-destruction, disguised as a cartoon symphony. It proved that satire could be art and that beauty could emerge from chaos. Number 5. Coonskin, 1975. Ralph Bakshi once again tore through the fabric of censorship with Coonskin, a film so controversial that it sparked riots before it even premiered. Mixing live action and animation, it followed three Harlem hustlers, Rabbit Preacher and Fox, as they clawed their way through a corrupt, racist underworld ruled by crime, politicians, and prejudice. Bakshi used cartoon archetypes to attack stereotypes, and the result was explosive. The NAACP condemned it before release, claiming it reinforced racial caricatures. Protesters picketed theaters shouting for bans. In reality, the film was a savage anti-racist satire exposing how media weaponized imagery against minorities. But nuance rarely survives public outrage. United Artists panicked, pulled it from theaters, and tried to bury it. Production was chaos from start to finish. Animators left fearing violence. The crew faced bomb threats, and screenings were canceled across cities. Bakshi refused to back down, calling it the most honest film he ever made. Critics later agreed, describing it as the most daring racial allegory in animation history. But at the time, its very existence was treated as a crime. For years, Coonskin disappeared, traded only on bootleg tapes whispered about by students and filmmakers. When it was rediscovered decades later, it was hailed as prophetic, a furious piece of street poetry that saw America's contradictions clearer than any newsreel. Today, it remains both misunderstood and irreplaceable, a scar that still bleeds truth about race and censorship. Number 4. 1001 Nights, 1969. Long before anime became mainstream, Osamu Tezuka, Japan's god of manga, created a trilogy of films known as the Animorama series. The boldest of them was 1001 Nights, a lavish retelling of ancient Middle Eastern legends through surreal, experimental animation. It combined myth, satire, and political commentary into a dizzying dreamscape, unlike anything Japan had produced. Tezuka's collaborator Eiichi Yamamoto filled the screen with swirling colors and symbolic imagery merging Persian art and pop surrealism. Beneath the surface, the film questioned power, greed, and faith, daring to show human desire as both divine and destructive. For Japan, in the conservative late 60s, this was unthinkable. Censors slashed scenes, entire sequences were deemed inappropriate for public viewing, and theaters hesitated to screen it. Behind the scenes, Tezuka fought not for fame but for evolution. He believed animation could speak to adults, not only children, and this film was his manifesto. Yet critics turned on him, calling him reckless and obscene. The studio nearly went bankrupt after its release. Only years later did historians recognize how revolutionary it was, combining Eastern mysticism with modern psychology, decades before Western animators would even attempt it. 1001 Nights is now seen as a lost treasure of global animation history, a kaleidoscope of rebellion, faith, and forbidden beauty. It pushed boundaries so far that they shattered, paving the way for the mature storytelling style that Japanese animation would later perfect. It stands as a reminder that even the brightest dreamers were once censored for daring to dream too vividly. Number 3. The Adventures of Prince Achmed, 1926. Long before Walt Disney's first feature, a German woman named Lotte Reiniger crafted an animated miracle. The Adventures of Prince Achmed was the world's earliest surviving feature-length animated film, yet its story was far from innocent fairy tale. Built from thousands of delicate paper silhouettes moved by hand frame by frame, it told an Arabian Nights saga of demon sorcerers and forbidden transformations. To most audiences of the 1920s, this shadow play seemed magical, but conservative critics found it threatening. Reiniger's silhouettes moved with eerie sensuality, and her themes of transformation, power, and illusion felt too adult for the time. German censors hesitated to release it, fearing backlash from religious and political groups who saw the imagery as pagan. In Britain, several scenes were quietly cut before screening. Behind the curtain, Reiniger worked under immense pressure. Germany's Weimar era was unstable, and funding for art was scarce. The film was created with a tiny crew in a small attic studio using stop-motion techniques so complex that some scenes took weeks to finish. Reiniger's determination was heroic. She fought for artistic independence in a world dominated by men and by fear. Though ignored for years, Prince Achmed was rediscovered decades later and hailed as one of cinema's purest acts of imagination. Its beauty transcended censorship. Its defiance inspired generations from Disney animators to avant-garde directors. Today, it remains both a relic and a prophecy, the shadow that predicted the light and the freedom that animation would someday reclaim. Number 2. Animal Farm, 1954. When the British animated adaptation of George Orwell's Animal Farm premiered, it carried a secret so deep it would take decades to uncover. To the public, it was a bold retelling of Orwell's allegory about animals overthrowing humans only to be enslaved by their own leaders. But behind the scenes, the production was being quietly funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. At the height of the Cold War, Western governments saw Orwell's story as perfect propaganda against Soviet communism. Yet the filmmakers were not told the full truth. Censors demanded changes that reversed the author's intention. The bleak ending, where all power corrupts, was replaced with a hopeful finale showing the animals rising again. The message was twisted. Critics were divided. Some called it powerful, others felt it was hollow. The British Board of Film Censors passed it with warnings about its political overtones. Eastern Bloc nations banned it outright. The controversy grew when Orwell's widow protested the altered ending, calling it betrayal. Production itself was grueling. Husband and wife animators John Hallis and Joy Batchelor spent years creating hand-painted scenes that fused realism and allegory. The studio nearly collapsed from exhaustion and government interference. Years later, declassified CIA documents revealed the manipulation. What had been marketed as an art film turned out to be a weapon. Yet even in distortion, Animal Farm stood as a warning about power, fear, and control. It proved that even animation could be corrupted by politics, yet it also showed that truth has a way of surviving censorship's shadows. Number 1. Watership Down, 1978. Though technically arriving just after 1975, its production and censorship battles began earlier, placing it firmly within the legacy of dangerous animation. Watership Down appeared to be a story about rabbits, but beneath its pastoral surface hid one of the darkest animated allegories ever made. Based on Richard Adams' novel, it followed a band of rabbits fleeing destruction, and searching for sanctuary in a world that mirrored humanity's brutality. Parents expecting a gentle children's tale were horrified. The violence, the psychological despair, and the haunting tone led to bans and edited versions across schools and TV networks. British broadcasters rated it for families, but viewers flooded stations with complaints. Censors debated whether animation could ever portray death and pain so graphically. Behind the scenes, director Martin Rosen fought to preserve the novel's integrity. Major studios refused to fund it, calling it unmarketable. The production relied on independent financing and constant compromise. Animators worked through exhaustion, layering naturalistic beauty over existential terror. The final sequence of death and transcendence stunned audiences worldwide. Critics were divided, yet decades later, Watership Down is celebrated as one of animation's great works of poetry. It taught that animation could be as powerful and tragic as live-action cinema. It was not a story about rabbits, it was a story about survival faith and the cost of freedom. Censors could not silence that truth. Before 1975, animation was not just fantasy, it was rebellion, painted frame by frame. These 12 films broke rules and risked oblivion just to say something real. Each one proved that ink could cut deeper than any blade. Which of these forbidden animations shocked you most? Like, share, and subscribe for the stories they tried to erase.